Hello everyone, welcome to join us. Today we are going to talk and discuss about classical Chinese literature. China has a wealth of classical literature, both poetry and prose, dating from the Eastern Zhou dynasty and including the classics attributed to Confucius. When traditional literary scholars refer to classical literature, they usually mean that this literature is widely acknowledged as having outstanding or enduring qualities. In ancient China, people had various emotions to express when historical events took place, both joyful or grave. Classical literature possesses a profound culture and is the condensation of the spirit, morals, and wisdom of the Chinese people. It reflects the high level of civilization. The literary forms vary over the long period, and each had its blaze of glory. It is worth noting that here we can only give a rough introduction to the most important literary forms and representative works, as Chinese classical literature is very extensive and profound. In-depth reading is highly desirable to truly appreciate the charm and beauty of Chinese classical literature. So, the first question I'd like to ask everyone to think about is, what are the forms of Chinese classical literature? Chinese classical literature generally derived from philosophical or religious essays, such as the works of Confucius and Lao Tzu. These writings were often about how people should act and how the society and political system should be organized and operated. A strong tradition of historical writing also evolved. Poetry became well established as a literary form during the Tang Dynasty, from the year 618 to the year 907. One of China's greatest poets, Li Bai, was in this period. This tradition of poetry, often dealing with the relationship of humans to their natural surroundings, has continued. Drama is another old and important literary form. Chinese drama usually combines local dialect with music and song, which has always been popular with the common people. Early Chinese novels often stressed character development and are usually centered on an adventure or supernatural happening. An example is the classic Ming version of The Water Margin. Historical themes were also popular, such as in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, written in the late Yuan period. There were also love stories such as the extremely popular Dream of the Red Chamber, probably most famous Chinese novel. Often, these works were written in the local dialect. In this section, we will focus on classical poetry. In fact, the most ancient Chinese poems, the mostly anonymous poems of the 11th to 7th century BC in the books of songs, also known as Shi Jing or the classic of poetry, are in many cases short pieces recording the voices of the common people, who, like common people everywhere, sing of their joys and sorrows, with little hope of heaven's support or the king's kindness. It is the oldest existing collection of Chinese poetry, comprising 305 works. The content of the books of songs can be divided into two main sections: the airs of the states and the eulogies and hymns. The airs of the states are shorter lyrics in simple language that are generally Asian folk songs which record the voice of the common people. They often speak of love and romance, longing for an absent lover, soldiers on campaign, farming and housework, and political satire and protest. On the other hand, songs in the two hymn sections and the eulogies section tend to be longer ceremonial or sacrificial songs, usually in the forms of dynastic hymns which praise the founders of the Zhou dynasty. The best known piece in the Book of Songs is probably Guanju. You may compare the different English translation versions and see which one you like most. The next important period in the history of Chinese classical literature is Tang Dynasty and the Five Dynasties. So, the second question is, how about literature in Tang Dynasty and the Five Dynasties? The period from the year 618 to the year 960, the time of the Tang Dynasty and the Five Dynasties, is considered China's golden age of poetry. The works of more than 2,000 points, totaling more than 48,900 pieces, have been preserved. The writing adapted traditional verse forms and created new ones. Among the new and popular forms were regulated verse, truncated verse, and a song form called ci. Regulated verse, or 律诗, is a form with 8 lines, each of which is made up of 5, 6, or 7 characters. Truncated verse, or 绝句, is an outgrowth or a shortened version of the 律诗. It omits either the first 4 lines, the last 4 lines, the first 2 and the last 2 lines, or the middle 4 lines. Thus, the tonal quality of the 律诗 was retained, whereas antithetic structure was made optional. Ci is the most comparable to the natural rhythm of speech and easily understood. The ci served as a major style for poetry during the Song dynasty. Li Bai and Du Fu are the two of the greatest poets in old Chinese literature who lived during the Tang dynasty. Li Bai, courtesy name Tai Bai, art name Qinglian Jushi, was a Chinese poet acclaimed from his own way to the present as a romantic figure who took traditional poetic forms to new heights. He was a romantic who celebrated things such as drinking, friendship, and nature, as well as solitude and the passage of time. His work showed a great deal of imagination and had a fresh approach to old themes, which were also written in a romantic style. Among the most famous are Waking from Drunkenness on a Spring Day, The Hard Road to Shu, and Quiet Night Thought, which still appear in school texts in China. Du Fu was a Chinese poet and politician of the Tang Dynasty. His greatest ambition was to serve his country as a successful civil servant, but he proved unable to make the necessary accommodations. In his work, he also celebrated the beauties of nature and signed for the passage of time. But he was ironic and critic. Du Fu's great reputation in literature comes most obviously from his expert use of all types of poetic style. His mastery of the regulated verse form is unmatched. Chinese prose also underwent a stylistic reform during the Tang Dynasty. The major change was brought about by Han Yu. He promoted classic Confucian doctrines at a time when they had begun to fall into neglect because of the rising popularity of Buddhism and Taoism. In his writing, he advocated a return to the free, simple prose of the ancient philosophers. His own essays are among the most beautiful ever written in Chinese and became models for the style of writing he regarded so highly. At his death, he was honored with the title Prince of Letters. How about literature in Song Dynasty? The Song Dynasty was marked by cultural advancement and military weakness. During this period, literary output was increased, thanks mainly to the improvement of printing and to the establishment of public schools throughout the empire. Nearly all the literary genres in verse and prose were continued, and some trends began in Tang times or accelerated. During the Song Dynasty, especially in the 11th century, the Ci form of poetry and song was brought to its greatest heights, particularly through the efforts of China's best woman poet, Li Qingzhao. She produced 6 volumes of poetry and 7 volumes of essays, all of which have been lost except for some poetry fragments. Other masters of the Ci were Su Dongpo and Xin Qiji. In prose, the reform initiated by Han Yu in the name of ancient, more straightforward style was re-emphasized by such 11th century writers as Ouyang Xiu and Su Dongpo. Both men held high rank in the civil service and were great painters as well as leading points. Nevertheless, their contribution to prose writing was as important as their poetry. The movement was further supported by men such as Zhu Xi, the scholar philosopher and principal formulator of Neo-Confucianism. In this section, we discussed about the representative forms of Chinese classical literature and talk about the most ancient Chinese poems in Shi Jing and the literature in Tang Dynasty, Five Dynasties, and Song Dynasty. We'll continue our discussion about Chinese classical literature in the next section.